So it's a couple years ago that we started doing this theory of change thing in IA, and I'm really excited about it. But I wonder, Scott and John, because you were the leads on it, could you say a word or two about why you thought this change was important? Because we had a vision, mission, values, goal statement, right? So why was this important? So John Saltmarsh is the head of our strategy committee on the board. Scott is one of the co-directors.
Well, John, when we started this conversation on staff about theory of change, it was very much motivated by what I was handed, which was a diagram, basically it's a little snippet on a piece of paper that you and Dudley and the strategy committee had been working on that said, well, the first part of Imagining America's work was building the organization. The next part is about catalyzing the movement. I don't remember the exact phrase. And that's actually one of the reasons I accepted the job. Because if that was what this organization was going to be thinking of itself as, then I'm in. So because I come from a background where I've taught and studied and done community organizing, I thought that the metric of the world as it is, the world as it should be, and strategies would be a useful way to move that piece that you had put on the table.
So why theory of change and not logic model? Because there are people on the board who are more comfortable with logic model.
Well, let me see if I can just provide a little bit of background here. For Dudley and I was working closely with Dudley on the strategy committee. The question really became, what's going to guide this organization as it moves forward? What are the actions that it's going to take? Not the critique and analysis, but the actions. And I think that's actually a really hard conversation, particularly for academics. We're really good at the critique and the analysis, but we're not actually good at the actions. And many of us know that from the conversations we've been in, that this gets reinforced for me all the time, where I'm in a board meeting where academics are doing all the critique and the community partner raises their hand and says, what's your theory of change? Right? So, because they want to know the actions. So,
critique will produce change.
So what we were trying to put on the table is, let's be explicit. What is the theory of change for this organization? And that will hopefully guide us in terms of what then do we do? What do we do? And so that's why we were really pushing this. And that's, I think, why you stepped into that, because it raises this question of not only what are we doing as an organization, but what are we trying to do to build a larger movement, and what does that mean to build a larger movement? So that's sort of the groundswell behind all of this. That's the way. That's the way I think of it. You want to
the one thing you said about why not a logic model, I just remember Dudley relating a story. I've lost all the details, but the essence of it is something. There was some conversation about logic models, and someone said, do you think Dr. King and SCLC had a logic model? What would have happened if he would have been, if some foundation would have demanded a logic model?
Well, the difference, I think, because I've done a lot of work with logic models too, is the logic model forces us into a set of metrics, which I don't think we want to deal with. Right? It doesn't mean that we don't want impacts and outcomes, but we don't want the kinds of metrics that logic models tend to drive us into. I think that's sort of resistance to the logic model.
I would resist both models insofar as neither of them appear to me to arise specifically out of the fields of art and humanities. But I think it's important to look at models for other community organizations. But what I find missing in this document is what we do as artists and humanist scholars. And how you only have sort of a hint of it when we talk about collective actions and the development of public narratives. We're fantastic at developing narratives. There's nothing about imagery, there's nothing about design in this at all. And I think that we're always going to be limited if we look to social sciences or even political change models that don't incorporate the arts. And I would argue there isn't one, at least that I know of. We should invent it.
Well, I'm a public policy person, and I absolutely value the arts, but I suppose I see them as essential components of change. And so I'm here not so much to engage in expanding the arts, but loving the arts for what they do. And what they do, I think, at their highest level, is they play a role in redefining the social constructs They actually speak to people at another level in their brain. And that's the way, I think the real issue for change is that we have to change those fundamental social constructs that stack together to see how we see the world. And art has a way of sliding into your heart, has a way of sliding into your soul to remind you that you're human. And that humanness, I think, is the basis of social change. And I think it's rooted in that, it's rooted in the kind of the, I have to think about that. You inspired me, I'll just pause for a second.
Well, the humanity is essentially what's at stake. That there are so many stories in circulation, and the ones that are most powerful are controlled by the people that have the most access to disseminating the stories, and disseminating the images, or disseminating design. And that one of the most critical things we can do to bring about change is to allow people whose stories are told about, so that policy is made that affects them. For example, the welfare mother, the super predator, black male felon. To get the alternative stories out there, not just to affirm our own humanity, but to affirm the humanity on which policy is built because it's denied.
Right, actually, I agree with you. I agree that social change is rooted in as practitioners of social change, as people who are in academic settings, our job is to understand the change around us. It's not like we're in charge of making change. It's about, because the change is happening, we're in charge of affecting change. And I do a lot of community work, and I learned a long time ago is you go in to do something, but you have to pause and you actually have to look at where that community is, because if you go in with what you think they need, you're usually not meeting them where they are. And that's a metaphor, really, for, it's about observing it. And art, you don't have to have permission. Art, you don't have to have permission. You can paint it on a wall. It's graffiti. Art is people rapping on a street, and it's much more than that. But you can't, it's not, art moves from class to class. So the reason, and there was a question in our group about why not public policy. Well, I'm telling you, it is public policy. Art needs to be alive so we can remember who we are when we're in those discussions.
So just part of why I tapped into this, because I was being struck by, I'm assuming a lot of people were at the Dream Theater Revival last night, and I hadn't seen it yet. I'd obviously heard a lot about it and everything else, but I was just thinking as I was sitting here of some of the stories, especially some of the images that were going on at the very beginning, and then with the really powerful moment with the education and kind of the Frankenstein thing, and I was thinking how even in the last 7 days, we'll just take the last week. So I'm kind of a rabid Facebook poster of just news stories and kind of get stuff out there. But it's always like, it's what they are. These are news stories. So it's the same issues of talking about the issues in education, of kind of the narrow views of this, and how different the arts really are at communicating and expressing something that you don't do justice even in a popular kind of magazine or something. You don't have that same, well, for me, sitting in a church, in a pew, and I've grown up in churches, and so it was an interesting, but in Catholic churches, so you have, you do all the things, and so it was very different watching all of this occur. I was like, wow, this would never happen where I was. But what an interesting reality to be in a place with a bunch of people who you knew were passionately connected to all of this, but in a way that wasn't just heady. It wasn't just, because it was reaffirming and confirming everything we already know, that what the educational system does to students and how we think about democracy and how we practice it, and then to have it visually and artistically and musically portrayed. It was just something like I knew the arts are such a critical piece to this, but what a powerful way to do it. And it took me back to a project we did this summer. Our institution, actually Kevin Bott came down and worked with us with one of our communities. We used community theater to get at racial tension in a community. And I've told this to a couple people here last day. Everybody knew these issues, so it wasn't like all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we have deep problems in the community. But here it was presented and articulated in a way that it wasn't just like, oh, the African American community and the Latino community don't get along. But how do we actually do something about it? And how do because we have what emerged out of this we call friendship dinners. That's a monthly dinner that the institution sponsors, but also community organizations or just people. So we have a dinner that gets at some pretty serious acts of violence a couple of years ago. And this has been a sustained thing. And so we did the theater project during our friendship dinner. And now there's a group of people, residents, primarily not people from our institution at Wagner, who are continuing community theater because they saw this as not just as like a one-off, like, wow, that was really good this time, but seeing this as a continued way to have conversations, and not just conversations, but to actually act it out. How do we get at some of these really deep problems? And so I just want to say, like, for me, because I enjoy art, but I'm not an artist in the way that a lot of people identify themselves here. But I think there's such a need, even though we're not a heady, IA is not a narrowly defined kind of academic venue, but to really stay committed and passionate about the ways we articulate and express these really deep, meaningful issues that we're all trying to do in a whole host of ways, but I think that this artistic angle is really interesting.
I guess I just don't see a big gap between theory of change and design thinking. Because if the design challenge is how do we close the gap between higher ed and what's going on at the grassroots and the grassroots struggle, as we said this morning, then it seems to me that theory of change is a way of methodically going about to resolve that design challenge. So maybe it isn't the experiential, sliding into that art that Sheila spoke about, but it doesn't seem really hopeful to me to say this didn't come out of design, arts, and humanity, therefore it's not of use to us. And that's maybe not what you were saying.
I was interested in theory of change because I'm on a social change organization board where they had very successful experience, and I was involved in their theory of change. And that group provides social services and does all kinds of things that fit very neatly. I think we can have a theory of change. I think it's a pragmatic tool, so I think it will work as well as any other. Fine. But then as we articulate it, I think we really need to emphasize what the arts and humanities can do. Because we have inherited in our world both all of the Enlightenment thought that many people don't have that much access to, and we can provide that to them. We have also inherited the dancing and singing practices that have been modes of resistance to slavery and other acts of oppression for centuries. And that as artists and humanists, we can use those tools to bring about change in ways that are different from other kinds of liberal organizations.
Let me look at it from another angle. So, using Bruce's invitation to say what kind of strategy of change, theory of change we like. I think what's significantly missing from the cultural studies world of arts and humanities and design is politics. I think, in fact, it's often counterposed. We do cultural stuff, or when politics is seen, it's protest politics. We're against oppression, we're in the struggle, the world is divided between the oppressors and the oppressed. So I want to recall what's missing from the historiography of Ella Baker and much of the literature on the civil rights movement. And I say this both as a student of that literature and also as someone who was a kid in the civil rights movement whose dad was on the executive committee of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And who all of my relatives in the South had disowned us. So Baker and Rustin and the people who shaped SCLC believed in what was called popular politics. In the 30s it was called popular front. They believed you had to win over 80% of the American people if you had significant change. And what that meant for me as an activist, a field secretary, was Martin Luther King assigned me to organize poor whites who were the people who had disowned us as a family. So, and you didn't do that by going and preaching to folks. You had to connect with people, find out traditions and symbols and histories and stories that you could relate to. I mean, it was a really disciplining challenge. And I think higher education is terrible at that. It's good at critique, but even when it's activist, it's good at polarizing and demonizing and saying, those Tea Party people are terrible, Republicans in general, or rural people, or church people, are the enemies. We're not going to make much change there. I think we have to, it doesn't mean we don't analyze power, and we don't analyze structures, and we don't analyze dangers. That's part of politics. I mean, people like Reston were brilliant at it. But they also had a vision that you can actually win the support of the vast majority of people, and you do that not simply through elections or through protests. I mean, Reston's famous thing that needs to be put in tension with Ramsky was the great essay from Protest to Politics in 1965, which was a warning to what he saw was the growing politics of posture in the whole student movement, both black and white, that was going to open the way for reaction. That's what he wrote about. And of course, he was prophetic. He was right. I mean, it's talking about a theory of change. He understood it. And he had lived it in the 30s when the global left thought it was going to be great to polarize against not only the right, but the socialists, because then we'd have communism. I mean, that turned out to be a disaster. So that was the birthplace. But I think a politics that is both on the ground, gritty and particular and specific and expansive. I like your thing about bringing the soul in. But that means not reductionist, not defining people in terms of labels and categories and stereotypes and boxes. I think we're terrible at that in higher education. We do that all the time. But it also means thinking of a strategic mapping of the power dynamics of our world, which do involve dangerous concentrations of economic wealth, but they also involve what a colleague in South Africa, Kalewa Manku out of the Black Consciousness movement, calls technocratic creep. And progressives have been more responsible for that than the right. In fact, conservatives are often more resistant to the idea that experts have the answers and people with degrees and credentials should be at the center. I mean, that's been the disease of what's called mass politics. So I think we need to bring, I think one of the great potentials of Imagining America is to redeem the political soul of the arts and humanities. But politics not as partisan politics, but in the original, deeper sense.
I was going to jump on the other point, so I'm going to miss it.
I just want to, I think that at its core, politics is the deeply embedded mythologies that we sort of operate on. And I think that they've evolved over decades, centuries, and millennia. And the way people interpret, a myth is not something that isn't true. It's a skeletal structure of meaning that gets reshaped by stories in any given time. And to bring together political factions that think of each other as enemies and to be truly political in a more meaningful sense than just protest politics, perhaps, is something that the arts can do specifically, because the arts are about story. They're about images that present a landscape of cognitive and social structure. They help us not only understand what we believe and care about, but to make it ubiquitous and beautiful so that we don't forget it. That's a kind of deep civilization building stuff that is the sort of engine room of politics. And nothing can do that, in my view, better than the arts. But what I think is sort of missing from the theory of change that's articulated here, and one which I could buy into more, and if it were to be shifted a little bit, I could buy into it more, is, I think, an explicit description of the mechanisms of how art does that. And I think that there is a little bit of fiction around the idea of emotion and empathy as the driver of art's contribution. I think it's big.
No, I agree with you.
Right.
I agree with you.
I think it's huge, but we humans have shown that they can be really dispassionate in really frightening ways. But I think the good news is I think that argument can be made extremely well, The bad news is that it can't be made exclusively just with the arts, humanities, and design. It incorporates the social sciences, certainly incorporates the voices of people who are never heard from, and you know, it's a much wider thing. So I think that the building of any kind of wall between arts, humanities, and design and the rest kind of is not only not useful, it's very negative. But I think elevating arts, at the same time, I think elevating arts, humanities, and design as a key to what we can do now, really putting it more in the strategy sector, which makes a great story, could work.
Keep jumping on the arts point. As somebody whose work is visual and arguing for a lot of these things, I think I was a mathematician as an undergrad. And I know you say that, people say, oh, that's so smart. And I'm a comic book maker as a doctoral student. And so people say, oh, you're so talented. And so there's, you've been talking about walls. And I mean, but this is true. And so, making comic books or making art of any sort is really smart. I mean, so I think the fact that we see arts as sort of it resolved to put aside aesthetics or icing on top. It denies the fact that, you know, we first made sense of the world through making pictures on the wall, and we still make sense of the world by how we lean towards each other, how we, you know, our bodies and our things the marks we leave on the world are deep thinking. So I think if we think about changes we should or could have, the whole thing about language I have to work on. But you know, if we, instead of saying yes, we need the arts involved because that'll help us do these things, if we say we need thinking involved, and thinking looks like making pictures, thinking looks like telling stories, thinking looks like mathematics, thinking looks like whatever thinking looks like that humans do, then that seems like there's a kind of change. So I'm taking out on that.
Nobody's talking on you.
You're in there.
So I don't have an arts background, but it really strikes me that a lot of the language that I hear since kind of come to this world is so familiar to me in the way that I organize. I have done community organizing in Mexico and in various parts of this country. And I think the most central part of organizing for change, in my experience, is the narrative work and the relational work. And in my field, many people think that United Farm Workers in the room went down when they started doing that. It started and became popular because they went door to door talking to people and hear people's stories and then organizing from that basis. And that stops when we start getting busy and when we grow and all that and fundraising, getting into the creativity, and then we forget to go back to basics. Now that's huge for our democratic society, right? Because we don't have participation in our democratic society. We just had a mayoral election in LA, and I think less than 30% voted. So we just started from there. But that's not just in higher ed. I wish in some ways that this were just true for higher ed, but it really is our society. But it's big in higher ed. I'm doing research where I am at the USC in Los Angeles and interviewing faculty, interviewing community partners. And the biggest thing that comes up is that they don't know what anybody's doing. But then the second biggest thing that I'm finding is that what they tell me is, you know, sometimes I feel like I should close disciplines and that it would be fun and it would be interesting, it would be good for students, it would be good for, but then I stop because I think, who's gonna get the credit? Who's gonna pay for it? And who's gonna, so then we have, not only do we not have rewards, but we have disincentives to do that. Now USC is a private institution, it's huge, it's a business, it's all of that, but I don't think it is alone as an institution of that type in our community. So I think that when we're talking about creating change in higher ed, really talking about change in the culture.
I just want to say that, I mean, I come to this as an unabashed critical theorist and also a cultural activist, and sometimes I am afraid of sort of the fetishizing of change and action and not really coming to grips with like the process of change, which really involves a deep analysis and understanding of the theories. And so something that I do find missing from the theory of change is sort of the naming of what is our analysis. You know, we were talking about this yesterday. Like in my activism, I might have a woman of color analysis, and that helps me understand what are the actions that need to take place in order to create the change that I want. And so it's sort of like, you know, I would like to see a naming of our critique of militarism, of our critique of white supremacy, you know, and how do we do that in a non-dogmatic way so that it's not that, you know, we become just another ideology or an ism, but really be courageous enough to say, what is our analysis of higher ed and how did we get here and where do we want to go? The other thing is I do agree that I think that, you know, I consider myself a, you know, multidisciplinary thinker, but I think the particular discipline of art and art history actually has something incredibly valuable to lend to our understanding of change happens and what would it take to, for example, see social change as durational performance art. And, you know, to really, you know, grasp sort of the lens of which, how we were trained, and not just to throw out the, you know, whole thing, the baby, the bathwater, the bathtub in the house, but to sort of say also there's something in our sort of disciplines that can also be, you know, there's a renaissance there that we can actually bring to this conversation around democracy, and what is it, and how do we engage in that?
By being more inclusive, you might actually be able to sort of elevate the importance of arts and art history even more.
Yeah.
You know, it's great.
And transform the discipline as we do it, but
Yes.
not to be solely as the protesters within our discipline.
Yes, that reverse critique is extremely important. I think that actually, you know, it's a multidisciplinary argument, but I think one of the great things about describing how art and having a theory built around it, you know, how that theory can work, one of the great things about it is it's based on very well-established sort of cornerstones of art history, of social science, and so on. In other words, it's not how art works as a language of culture to shift behavior, to be frank, is not a very esoteric. It's a model that people can actually wrap their brains around. At least that's my experience. You know, it's got a few points to it, but it's not crazy. You know, it's not. You don't have to be able to, you know, read critical theory to understand.
I find John Dewey's work on art really helpful here. I'm an art historian, and I think, you know, his idea of art as a method, and to think of it as a way, and the reason it's the ideal of human experience for Dewey is that it's a way of doing and undergoing simultaneously, acting and reflecting. And so if we think of the arts in contribution of building democracy, a method that we teach, then it becomes interdisciplinary. It isn't I think as long as we let ourselves be hemmed in by the walls of the academy as they stand now and think, you know, more in terms of process. And again, you know, I love what you just said about, you know, fetishizing this idea of action and change. You know, it's this end product, and maybe the call to action is actually our own self-reflection on teaching process and being aware of the processes that we're putting into place. And that is the role of the academy in society at large, is to teach method and process and not focus on some end goal, but so how do we, in the smallest ways of self-reflection and getting to Harry's point, you know, about the narcissism of the academy, you know, that if we build into our own practice this doing and undergoing the self-reflection that comes out of the arts, perhaps, you know, to me it does, that humbles us, and that is actually what I think we need to bring to the table, a greater humbleness and awareness of our own processes, rather than this end goal of change and action. we're missing all of the part in between that is so subtle and so unrecognized and so absolutely essential.
And I'm going to close this off in just about 2 minutes, so I think the seats are now stable.
I think one of the things that we need to think about too, sometimes you can look at your adversary as very powerful, but if you go to a lot of the national conferences, they're really scared and embattled. And in fact, if you're going to, Harry's point about trying to convince the poor whites, I mean, to me, like the poor whites are the people going to MLA, I'm a literature professor. I mean, who are, and one of the things about politics is asking yourself, what do people hope for and what do they fear? And in a lot of the humanities, our students are leaving the humanities, they're going to other fields, people are really worried about their jobs, and the ways in which what we're doing not only benefits the society, but the ways that it will benefit the field itself and enrich the field, that's a really important message that our fields need to get. So yes, it's going to help the communities in all kinds of wonderful ways, but students are going, it's sort of reciprocal altruism. It's also something that is going to go back to the field and reinvigorate it in ways that you go to MLA and it's like people wringing their hands about what they're going to do as people vacate the room. So I think we need to think about how we enrich the community, how we enrich the field too.
I love that point about humility, because as people in academia, we are as precarious as many of the people that we might feel more privileged than, especially depending on our location within the university. And we also need to be humble about knowing people are organizing out there without us all over the world. So we don't need to think about how are we going to include everybody, because we can't speak for everybody. We have to look at what our position is and what we can do from here. And I think also be wary of trying to export it to other fields. It's where we are. And I like the idea of understanding the theoretical framework of where we're coming from, but I don't know that we could find one. And I always think about Eve Sedgwick's observation in tendencies, that we don't need to fight about the best way to do it, because you're going to do what you're going to do, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and if we can find a way to talk to each other and support, great. If we can't, you do what you're doing and I'll do what I'm doing.
We need that there's a motivation toward something better and something good and making something better happen. And it's all really good. It's motivated from the best place. But I'm not sure if that motivation is towards inward, toward transformation of the institution, and then we feel solipsistic, and then we are pushed to go outward, and then we feel afraid that we're putting our ideas on someone else. And I'm just observing a sense of we're going around in this, and someone said loopiness. And I think we should, I don't know what I'm trying to say here except that it's okay. It's all right to want to transform our institution and us out, and it's okay to want to transform and work with our partners.
I just want to affirm that, actually. I mean, that came up in our discussion, came up in years in Fishbowl, including people who came up from our group. I would say one way we discuss it and one way I would think about it is feedback loop. That we're not loopy-loop, or at least what we need to be doing is feedback loop. That is, we need to, I think at our best, we're empowering what we do, which is one reason we're raising ourselves celebratory, but there's some dangers in that. But we're also then saying we need to open up and renew ourselves and all through that opening up process.
And I thought it was good design thinking and performance thinking both got at that, right?
I think one thing I heard over again was the power of narrative, and arts have the capacity really show us to ourselves and then maybe show possibilities to people that they hadn't even considered before. And in that consideration process, people can make different decisions about the kind of world they want to live in. So I was really, it's encouraged by how narrative came up in a lot of different instances from a lot of different backgrounds of people that are represented here.
Thanks for that comment. It's really helpful to have some, just sort of like what people heard.
Can I do one quick thing though, just as a response to that? I do, but I feel like what art does sometimes is also point out the oppressive nature of coherent narrative or historical narrative, and sort of how dangerous sometimes I feel like sort of storytelling can be when it sort of so much requires something makes sense, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and like there's the triumphant sort of notion of narrative that we I can't stand also. So that art, interrupts.
I think if I can point out one thing, everybody is entering this conversation from a particular place and set of perspectives and experiences, and I'm listening as a person sitting in the office, wondering what we're going to do in Magic America. And the thing that kept coming to my mind in this conversation is something Dudley said to me yesterday. He said, I don't particularly care about, he said, me and the people I come from are not academics, but you all seem to be interested in, but we care about higher education because it influences us, it impacts us. And so it's in my self-interest to be involved in Imagine America because you're talking about changing higher ed and it needs to be changed. And somehow, when we have these conversations, they explode into a million bits. And the focus on changing higher ed is not there anymore, or we get embarrassed by it. And that's a really tricky part of this conversation. The theory of change is about changing higher education. And of course, there's no one way to do that. And as we all know, you can't change it without deep engagement outside of higher education. That's part of the theory of change, right? We're not going to just sit off by ourselves and do that. So I just am continuing to think about how that focus plays out when there are thousands of ways to slice that focus and analyze it. How do we do that in a way that keeps a center to the conversation?
So we're running out of time, so maybe just some quick, Harry, Peter,
Well,
Holly, did you want to say something?
A couple of points. One, I think narrative is powerful if it's political. If it's not political, then it's sentimental and decorative in terms of making a serious democratic change. So it needs to be named as a discipline. And so there is an emotional side, but it's a discipline of learning to deal with people's stories who are very unlike you. So how to be uncomfortable, how to make yourself uncomfortable, that's what happens in really good listening, relational meetings. So that's a discipline, it's a practice. And secondly, to take narrative seriously is to reconceive our institutions not as static institutions, but as complex communities that need to be and can be changed. And thirdly, and this goes to the theory of PowerPoint, it means to think about the hidden power we have. So this is what Dolly's reacting to. So higher education is like the anchoring institution of citizenship. It's where people form their lifelong identities in their work, in their careers, in their professions, and usually now in quite dysfunctional ways that disempower most people in America. So we really have to change that around if we're going to be serious about change in any level.
I heard the narrative in a different way. I heard the narrative as not a beginning and end, but as an exchange. And I think that the fundamental piece is that reciprocity, is that you're not going to change the university without changing yourselves. We're not going to be a different university until we're different people. And the experience of the narrative is not to build something outside of ourselves. It's for us to be woven in. And once we are woven into that understanding, it's much easier to give a hand. And you arrive with something to give, but the fact is that the exchange changes you, and the next time you will give it differently. So the narrative isn't just like capturing and analyzing it. The narrative is the experience, and the experience is being shared. So I think that's what I heard from the conversation.
I'm a social scientist. I know nothing about art, methods, and theories. I bet that the artists in the room probably don't know as much about public policy analysis methods and theories. And so if we're really trying to break down that wall and change higher education, wouldn't it be nice if I took it on in a micro way of how do we teach social scientists about art methods and theories, and how do we teach art people about science methods and theories. And that's one of the reasons I'm here. So I think it serves an incredible role in higher education by maybe bridging those gaps, and maybe we ought to do it more explicitly.
Follow Bear Rest.